This is a True Colour group show at the Kevin Gallery in Dublin. Now, it's a group show, and it's a group show in several senses, in that they're not a coherent stylistic group. They don't all think the same thing and paint the same way, which is often the way these things are presented and conceived. They do share something more subtle and something that doesn't affect so much the way the actual appearance of the work that you see. Leila Anglad, whose painting here you can see, is the only one of the artists that I know has a specific interest in Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher. And it's his theory of perception that I think unites the work in this exhibition. And his theory is something like this. Perception, rather than being a kind of faculty that we happen to have, is a completely embodied experience. So we approach and apprehend the world through the body. There's no way around that. And it's not surprising at all that with Jean-Paul Sartre, Merleau-Ponty was one of the founders of what we know of as the existentialist movement in French philosophy. They later fell out, as French philosophers tend to in time. His view was very much rooted in the faculty of perception and taking on the world in terms of visuality. At a certain point, he became very interested in Cézanne, as did many people, because Cézanne posed a problem for conventional Western painting. And that problem was, where exactly does the substance of a painting lie? Is it in its ability to resemble what we think of as an external reality? Or is it that reality as filtered through the senses? And Cézanne and Merleau-Ponty in the end decide very much that it's a question of reality as filtered, as experienced by us, not some pristine external concept that can be played with and played around with. And Leila became interested in this idea of Merleau-Ponty's and how the world is, through us, experienced, not something out there external to us, but part of our experience. And how we take that on board is what the subject of her painting. I think looking at the work in this show, which is completely diverse visually, what it comes down to in each case is that acceptance of dealing with the world through your senses and gaining a hold on that world through your senses, rather than feeling intellectually superior to it in some way. By which I mean a spectator, a viewer of an image, normally feels an habitual sense of superiority, in that this is me, this is an image, I'm looking at it and I can figure it out. And that's actually quite comforting, and it situates us in a known, familiar world. Whereas all of these painters, I think, take a more problematic view of that process. And they're saying, this is the way I see it, and could it be? Is it possible? And maybe so. But they're responsive to the minutiae of experience as they go along and how they respond to it. Now, the way Merleau-Ponty puts this is, when you look at a painting, it's not like you're looking at something else in the world, like a stone or some other object in nature or a plant. You're looking at something through the eyes of a painter. And you have to take this on board so that he maintains that you don't so much look at a painting as you look with it, or to put it another way, according to it. You see the world according to the painter and according to the painting you're looking at, which is quite a different thing from being quite comfortably in control as you would get in, say, a generic, very familiar form. Now, I'd just like to talk about another painter in relation to this idea of familiarity and unfamiliarity, and that's Lilian Tomasco. Lilian Tomasco is a very interesting painter because while her work is very much rooted in direct bodily experience, she seems to look to other areas of generic artistic practice, but in fact she never loses contact with that basic sensual reality. Early on, the earliest works I saw by her, she was referring to the idea of the unmade bed and the way sheets can appear turbulent and rumpled and unkempt in the morning. And it's actually quite a powerful idea, as say in Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed, where you have this notion that the turbulence of life is sort of left like an echo in the spaces that we occupy. And in Lilian's case, the body was implied in its absence in the unmade bed, and the kind of experiences that it contains. What's interesting is that as she went on to develop, she didn't lean more into existing painterly language, but she remade it in her own image, in the sense that she didn't look for easy color harmonies or sentimental pictorial solutions. She introduced discontinuities and slightly acidic, uncomfortable combinations and intersections of curves, color, line, leaving us slightly adrift and having to readjust our pictorial thinking to come to terms with what she was doing. To look to another painter who deals with the same sort of question of where we are in relation to the painting, I would say, look to Aidan Murphy. And Aidan's work is absolutely rooted, as she says herself, in bodily experience of the world. But rather than making a representation of a figure, say, as traditional Western methods would suggest you would do, what she does is she looks at how we actually experience, and many writers do this as well, bit by bit, to build up a cumulative picture that doesn't accord with our habitual sense of a figure, a setting, but it's to do with multiple minute impressions that make up a whole that is quite different from the whole we're familiar with. It's like a finger here, a touch, a sense of inner world, or inside the body experience, and so it's sort of half familiar, but at the same time completely alien. So again, as with Lilian, we have to readjust to the world to take on what she was doing here. But once we do that, we find that, yeah, that is actually how we experience the world. She's not far away from where we are in terms of our day-to-day living. And and she comes up with paintings that look completely out of the norm, but actually are completely true to life. which is no small feat. Then the next painter I just want to talk briefly about is Aidan Lawler. Aidan is a very interesting painter because she's completely rooted in a very earthy kind of reality of tactile experience. And what she does is, she doesn't make a representation of a setting or a scene, but what she does is records her immersion in the experience of being there and how that feels from the inside to do that. And again, as with Aidan, the odd thing about this is that even though, to all intents and purposes, what we see is an abstract arrangement of gestures and shapes and forms and colors, it's sort of strangely relatable because we are all within a sensual world and we all go through the business of experiencing the world in a tactile, in a visual, in that immediate way all the time. And that is what she deals with. I think very comparable to Aaron's method of seeing and making a painting is Susan Montgomery. And it's very interesting that two painters who take very much the same starting point end up with things that look completely different in that way. But Susan, like Aidan, has that rooted kind of sensibility that is completely responsive on an immediate level to everyday sensation and everyday thought. And she takes that as an onslaught that we deal with and how we process that. So remarkably enough, although you would look at this and think it's a kind of atmospheric, very abstract painting, it could be, in a way, a portrait. It's an account of dealing with the world. Of course, we're not only individuals adrift in the world. We're also, we're inevitably in a social world, in a community, and that finds its way into every aspect of what we do and think. And carrying on from Aidan and Aileen, I think Natasha also addresses that sense of everyday experience. But what she looks at in particular are the idea of encountering others. And it's that curious space of encounter that interests her, and how important it is, but also how fleeting and how evanescent that overlap can be. And her work has this very light, fluid, dreamy quality. And it's like where all those things come together, you have the meeting of different conscious beings, and those things are fleeting and vitally important, but fleeting. So Stephanie Deedy's work continues in this vein of looking at the idea of a place in wider terms, in familial, in social, in communal space. And earlier on, Stephanie's work addressed the idea of the habitable space and the domestic space. And something interesting happened in that early work, which was that she looked at that space in terms of, again, how it's actually experienced. And it's not experienced as it would be in, say, an interiors magazine or something that presumes a kind of comfortable coherence. It was looked at in terms of how we experience it fragmentarily and how perhaps it doesn't quite add up, it doesn't come together. And it's more a question of us building that in our own minds and how we put it together and conceive it and make it. Later on, she looked at that communal space in another way, and that was how meaning is conjured or woven out of that meeting of people and sensibilities, and how important that is. As with Natasha, is that idea of the coming together of people who share something like a commonality and understanding, and how that can produce our happiest moments and our most important feelings, and how that attains a kind of magic or a kind of transcendence. And again, she doesn't make a conventional representation of those kind of things, but what she tries to do is get a sense from the inside of how those emotions fill a place. And you get these fascinating compositions that are, again, converge on the abstract, but actually are really about the heart of human experience each time. Diana Copperwhite was instrumental in making this show, which I think is interesting because from the beginning, Diana has been a tremendously tactile painter, but more everything in her work, color, gesture, line, comes from that immediacy I was talking about. It's a responsiveness to the world rather than looking at the world from the outside and making an analytic judgment. As it happens, Merleau-Ponty hated the word analysis and disapproved of the whole idea of analysis. And he looked at that kind of view of the world as being high altitude thinking, because his point was you can't do high altitude thinking because you're immersed in the stuff of the world. So it's very unwise to assume that you can take a longer view. What Diana does, I think, from the beginning is to address, one could say something like the complexity of modern life, which makes it sound like it's more complex than any other time. But of course, that complexity is always there. I mean, I don't think we live in a more complex environment than a hunter-gatherer who probably had to be sharper, quicker, and have a much broader range of knowledge than we do to negotiate our environment. But still, there's something about the current world where it's highly technological, it's highly invasive, it's difficult to deal with, it presents its own challenges. And it seems to me that from the beginning, Diana has been very involved in that question of addressing modernity in terms of how we experience modernity, rather than, say, an analysis of modernity. Diana chose a painting by Evie Hone to be part of the show, and I think that's interesting. I remember it always struck me, in fact, that her work goes very well with two foundational Irish artists, Evie Hone and Mamie Jellett, because of course Evie and Mamie were two of the people who had a serious go at taking on the whole question of modernism at a time when Irish art was absolutely stuck in something else, in a very academic tradition and method. And Evie and Mamie looked at Cubism. Now, in my view, they looked at Cubism in actually quite an academic way, but they did show that there was a completely other way of addressing the world. And it was a liberating thing to do. And as this beautiful radiant image shows us, it opened the door to great possibilities in Irish art to come. Mark Joyce has been a consistently interesting and tremendously unpredictable artist from early on. And like Diana Copperwhite, who we were talking about, you'll find that in his work sometimes the color spectrum appears, and the spectrum is fundamental to how we see the world, because light is divided into these colors, and that's the way we see it. We see those colors reflected. Now, what Mark has always been interested in is perception, how we see the world. And at one point I remember he used to go around with a camera, and rather than try to take photographs in the conventional way, what he would do was randomly hold the camera and shoot what he couldn't see. Because it was that moment of apprehension that interested him, when you didn't know what was there, and the photograph was a revelation. And his work looks at the nuts and bolts of that encounter, that unknown, and how it helps us make sense of the world or not. And with all of the artists in this show, as with Mark, what you find is that openness to maybe, maybe not. It's like if you're going to have a predetermined results, then essentially you're illustrating an idea. And that indeed is how many artists work, but it's sort of unsatisfactory, because I feel that if at the beginning of a work an artist knows what the end is going to look like, there's something not quite right about that. Whereas every painter in this show really, you could say, doesn't really know where the painting is going to go when it begins. And I think Mark is a perfect exemplar of that, because it's like when he begins, the painting is a process of discovery, and it's a process of experiencing the making of something in the world as a lived thing. And that's what's really important as a principle in what he does. So Mark Swords, from his days in college, has been a remarkably interesting artist. And his work is, to an exceptional extent, I would say, rooted in the idea of handcraft. And that is his approach to the world. I remember talking to him about a year ago or more, and he was saying how he had completely gotten into baking, I think during COVID, like many people. And it just struck me that, my God, Mark, you're a natural baker. You're a baker at heart, because everything he does has a center in how do you solve this material problem to make something in the world. And his approach to his painting is the same. I'm not saying that he bakes his paintings, but pretty close. It's all making marks and experimenting and seeing where it leads and how it can be used. And there's no sense, again, of a superior external viewpoint. There's a sense of being immersed in the material and seeing where the material leads. And where it's led him, actually, is into quite elaborate installations and constructions that use multiple craft abilities and multiple painterly abilities. And he's got a terrific painterly sensibility in terms of his use of texture, color, tone, line, pattern, and composition. Yeah, his compositions have this wonderfully relaxed, casual air, but always gain from being carefully, exhaustively considered, which you wouldn't think at first glance, but the more you look at them, the more satisfying they are. I think we could link Leslie Ann Connell to Mark in a way, in that she too has a very casual, easygoing attitude. She builds her works, you could say, mark on mark on mark. But every painter does that because it's layer on layer on layer. But with her, it's like there's a kind of curiosity about where a particular piece will lead. She'll add things to a composition, take them away. She'll add thread, add whatever, and you feel there's this slow, considered approach in what she does that is totally in keeping with Mark Zor's method, and absolutely depends on what Gerhard Richter once called the daily practice of painting, but in our case, the daily practice of art, because it's an accumulation of experience, and it's accumulation of experience bit by bit, seeing where it leads and how that can be adjusted and how can that be put in. Very much the way we deal with our encounters with the world every day. Eve Callahan, I think, is a very gifted painter, and in this piece, she's drifting slightly into sculpture, which she has done for quite some time, and very well. I remember her degree exhibition in NCAD, and by that stage, she stood out because she was such an accomplished, hard-edge abstract painter that she seemed totally in control of the language that she was using, and made beautiful paintings. And I remember thinking at the time, what's she going to do next? Because she has really mastered this medium. And the one thing I would say about them is they were particularly sensitive to minor adjustments in tone and color. And it made me think that what she really was looking at was light on a surface. And in fact, what she's done since has amplified that interest in light. And light, of course, is how we see the world. And our perception of light is everything to us visually. And she has gone on to explore that idea of looking how light makes our world and how it makes everything we know about it. And these beautiful paintings of extraordinary surfaces. If you look at her surfaces, they have a kind of richness of texture, delicacy and richness of texture. They do suggest a unity and a wholeness, but the late artist Patrick Scott used to say, if you're in doubt, start with a circle, because a circle is completion and unity, and you can't go wrong with that. And I think that Eve has that spirit of the circle is the world. Like Stephanie, whose work we were talking about earlier, and like Natasha, Sinead is interested in, her works are fantastically tactile and immediate and sensual but she's also interested in the wider communal sphere. Very much so, I think, from the beginning. And she's always been taken by ideas of communal activity, like spheres of communal concern, such as sporting arenas or theaters, stages, or other manifestations of communal experience. And again, she doesn't have the approach of making images of a sporting offence or anything like that. What she does is she deals with, from the inner experience of this sense of the warmth of community and of a social center to our being, so that our work is both inside and outside. And the structures that she makes in her work have this quality of addressing both the spaces we make for those experiences and what we feel when we encounter those spaces and are in them and get to know them. And that's quite a balancing act, and she does it very well for some years now, and always in this exploratory, hesitant, kind of, yet so far affirmative way. She always manages to get that balance right. Finally, I just want to say a couple of words about Danielle Tegeter, who, on the face of it, it's slightly different in that it's almost as if Danielle does have a high altitude view of the world, because it's like a diagram, her painting. But it is also true that generally in cognitive theory now, the understanding is that we don't actually experience the world so much in terms of inner representations, pictures in our brain, but more in terms of models. So we have a cognitive model of the world that we use to experience the world. And I think that's the leap that Danielle makes. Going on from Sinead, I think Danielle's works are like blueprints for social spaces or utopian spaces, going back to the old modernist idea of building a world from scratch, making something amazing. But Danielle's work, again, as with everything in this exhibition, is rooted in personal, direct, and instinctive understanding of the world. And I know that when you look at the background of where specific images come from, they are always rooted in that level of experience and that level of ritual and living and understanding. And they emerge from that as potential indicators of how the world might be a better place.